Hello and welcome back to PMS, everybody. It is 2024 and I hope you and your loved ones had a wonderful Christmas and New Year together. It has been a while, but I have certainly enjoyed my time off, the time that I spent with my family, and I am raring to go once again. So let's jump right back into the American founding as we are looking at the Pilgrims crossing the Atlantic Ocean today. Of course, if you have been following me for a bit, you'll know that the Pilgrims are actually separatists who did not have any more faith in the Church of England to go back to the pure faith, so they ended up separating from the church. As a result, King James imprisoned those who he caught, later released them under the order for them to go back under the wing of the Church of England. In 1607, they refused, and the Pilgrims, under the leadership of their pastor John Robinson, fled to Leiden, Holland, where they spent a few years there. Later, in 1609, another man who was running away from persecution of the church and state moved to Leiden, Holland, and his name was William Brewster. As Kathleen Myers says in her article about William Brewster, quote, Brewster established a press where books and pamphlets promoting separatist idea were printed. The pamphlets were illegally sent to England. Brewster also printed 2 books by David Calderwood that were directly critical of King James I of England. The English ambassador to Holland instigated a search for William Brewster and his press. Brewster went into hiding, his house was searched, and his printing type was seized. When the Leiden Church decided to establish a colony in the New World, its pastor John Robinson chose to remain in Leiden with the larger congregation. The next highest-ranking church official, William Brewster, agreed to make the voyage. He was accompanied on the Mayflower by his wife Mary and his youngest children, Love and Wrestling. Also placed in his care were the Moore children, Richard and Mary. The Pilgrims started off their journey by being heavily in debt to the Virginia Company. In order to cross the Atlantic, they needed to secure the funding for the voyage. During their time in Holland, though they lived there relatively unmolested, they were merely tolerated. The jobs they were given were menial labor and pitiful wages, and they were barely able to survive. As Ben Hart puts it in his book, Faith and Freedom, as immigrants in Holland, they were permitted only to engage in menial labor and were paid barely subsistence wages. They lived in Leiden for 11 years, often working from dawn well into the night. Because of the hardness of the place, they aged quickly and the number of them were taken away by death. But the abject poverty did not discourage the Brownists. The people often bore all these difficulties cheerfully and with resolute courage. Far more pernicious, wrote Bradford, was the manifold temptations of the place. The children were being drawn away from their parents by the evil examples of the Dutch. Due to what they perceived by them as ill influences and persecution by the English church and crown, they came to the conclusion that they needed to find a new life, a better life in the New World. They were willing to go heavily into debt to the Virginia Company, commission shoddy ships, and even leave some of their children behind with family while they relocated to the New World, where they knew death was a highly likely outcome. The 2 commissioned ships were known as the Mayflower and the Speedwell. However, the Speedwell proved to be completely unseaworthy, so the Pilgrims crowded themselves onto the already crowded Mayflower. The separatists were actually the minority on the journey. They only made up about 40 of the 102 passengers on the Mayflower. The rest were adventurers hoping to find excitement, or those of low social rank hoping to find a better life. Of all the people on board, the most notable people were Miles Standish, William Bradford, John Carver, and of course William Brewster. They set sail August 5th, 1620, and according to Bradford's journal, they encountered many fierce storms in which the ship was soundly shaken. After 7 weeks, 2 deaths, and many storms that blew them off course 300 miles, the Pilgrims landed at Cape Cod on November 9th, 1620. Now, I want you to imagine something with me for a bit. There were over 100 people on board this tiny ship. Privacy was something that was hardly known, and it's not as though everybody had their own room. I'm sure boredom would have become common, and there weren't any amenities like what we would have had on a modern-day cruise ship. No one showered, they would have had to use salt water to wash their face and their hands, and they would have had to use the English chamber pot to do their business. And of course, some lucky soul would have had the luxury of being the one to have to throw it overboard. It was crowded and smelly, and some had even left loved ones behind, including their own children. When they arrived in the New World, they had no one waiting for them to welcome them into a nice warm home. There was nothing built. There was no hotels, no bathrooms, no houses, no stockpile of food waiting for them. Everything had to be built from scratch. Everything had to be gathered from scratch. And even then, they were in the dead of fall with winter quickly approaching, and they knew that not everyone would make it through that first winter. And they were right. They lost half of the remaining people on the first winter, but they took to the seas, risking life and limb for the possibility of freedom. There they were seeking a better life, free from the tyranny of the church and the state, seeking the opportunity to worship freely as they had believed. Because of those storms, they were blown off course by 300 miles, and many of the passengers on board believed that the original Virginia Company patent, which had given the Pilgrims the permission to settle in Virginia, was no longer valid. They tried to sail around Cape Cod to reach the Hudson, but the winds prevented them from doing that. Mutinies were threatened, and even William Bradford wrote some of the words that were said describing the threats. Quote, "When they came ashore, they would use their own liberty, for none had the power to command them, the patent they had being for Virginia and not for New England." End quote. John Carver, who was elected governor of the ship during its crossing, helped keep the people together. They all came together and wrote the Mayflower Compact, which is the social contract that would be a set of rules that everyone would agree to live by. And so the Mayflower Compact was written. In the name of God, amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc. Having undertaken for the glory of God, and the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation, and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by the virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers, from time to time shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. This civil body politic would be the basis upon which American laws would come to life. The laws that were made would be agreed upon by the people. The Mayflower Compact became a pivotal document in the development of the constitutional government here in America. I love what Ben Hart wrote in his book Faith and Freedom about the Mayflower Compact and the importance of identifying God as the glue to hold this community together. Quote, "For without God as overseer, always tugging at the strings of conscience, the Mayflower Compact would have been nothing more than a scrap of paper. There was, after all, no legal redress available against those who decided to violate the agreement." And that is absolutely correct. Who would they have to be able to right the wrongs that had taken place? I believe from this very thought that not only would the Pilgrims know that the contract that was written was very fragile, but even the founding fathers knew that our national contract is just as fragile as well. That the only thing that would be holding everyone together was the common belief in God. Which is why such words as, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," were written into the Declaration of Independence. And I believe that these men knew that these freedoms that we enjoy can be preserved through God and God alone. Next time on PMS, Jamestown versus Plymouth.